Well, thank you, and I want to, I'm Charles Vincent. Hey, there you are, Charles. Thank you for being here. So I want you to know that I am not an entomologist, but I am staying at the Holiday Inn Express here downtown, which gives me some authority. I'm not sure what that is. And most of what I'm going to be sharing with you today was developed in collaboration with Charles Vincent, working with his kind of seminal work around BT and the microencapsulation of BT for a conference that we went to this summer in Quebec City with executives from scientific and engineering organizations. So these were non-scientific folk. They were administrative kind of folk, and we had a lot of fun with it. And so I'm going to be pulling some examples from that and working with that. So the things I'm going to share with you, some of them may seem very obvious to you, and some may not be so obvious, and I hope that they will be useful to you. So stories, and I am a storyteller by trade. I've been working with story for almost 30 years in all kinds of manner, and stories build engagement and advocacy. And when you're talking to any kind of an audience where that's important, that's a non-scientific audience, whether that becomes really crucial. And one of the things that I find is, the question is, why does it work so well? And stories reach and engage people longer than any other kind of communication. They embed information deeper. They embed it much deeper than any other kind of communication. People retain it for a longer period of time, and they recall it with higher accuracy. And probably the most important thing is that a story can create advocacy for your position. So if you want to go and create advocacy or engage an audience with a new technology, a new methodology, you've got to use story, I think, to be effective. So I've got 13 rules. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly. I'm going to use examples and hopefully tell a few stories along the way. And the first is to know your audience. And that's the first place you've got to start with. Who are you speaking to? If you're speaking to colleagues like in a conference like this, you can give one kind of presentation. But, for example, if you were going to the Reno Bar and Grill and you were a performing artist, you probably wouldn't want to open with an Enya song because you might have beer bottles coming at you from all kinds of directions. You might be better off with something that was, from Bruce Springsteen as an opener. And that would be obvious to all of us here. We would know that, but surprisingly, how many of you might go to a different kind of audience and give mostly a scientific explanation. So here you are, and I think this is actually from the Entomology Society of America, an exciting crowd who looks like they're really on the verge of becoming comatose. So, but if you're going to go speak to a legislative committee, or perhaps you're actually going to a foundation looking for funding, or whether it's a community meeting, or it could be, I was just talking to somebody while I was having a cup of coffee today who's from the University of Florida, and she's making lots of presentations to farmers. Well, farmers are not a scientific audience. They may know a little more than the average person, but understanding the science behind why you should use one application over another may not be in their wheelhouse. So you have to tailor your presentation. And here's some of the key factors that I think are important. And first, you need to know the level of expertise. What do they currently know? And how sophisticated are they? And then what's your time expectation? Do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 15 minutes like today? Or do you have a half an hour like I've been given today, which is actually a fair amount of time? And I'll sell some of my time to some of you later if I have extra time. But the most important thing may be the predisposition of your audience. And one of the things that I talk about a lot in my work is, what story are they living inside of? If you're talking to people who really hate pesticides, and you're trying to convince them of an intervention you want to do that's going to impact their fruit trees in California, which was one of the presentations, you need to be prepared to know how to talk to that audience versus an audience who might say, oh yeah, let's spray, let's go for it. So knowing what's their predisposition, what story do they live in with regard to your topic, is really crucial to ask yourself. And then what do they want to know from you? What do they want to know from you? So these are the kinds of questions that I would ask myself before I even began to sit down to fashion my presentation. Rule number 2 is start with the end in mind. So let's talk about some of those key factors. What's the purpose of the presentation? Are you wanting just to inform and teach people, and to what end? Or do you want them to do something? Do you want to spur an action? Do you want them to become an activist? Do you want them to let you come and inspect their trees? Do you want them to actually, if you're talking to legislators, to pass legislation? So you need to know what's the action you want them to take, and what do you want to see happen as a result. So if you have these things in mind, then you're really in a position to begin building a presentation. So rule number 3 is to harness the brain's remarkable capacity for engagement. Now, most presentations, typical scientific presentation, activates 2 regions of your brain. The Wernicke's area, which is where language comprehension takes place, and Broca's area, where language processing takes place. And when we make presentations with lots of information, lots of charts and graphs, that's mostly what's going on in the brain. But the truth is, there's a lot of more opportunity to engage other parts of the brain. And the brain's a pretty big place. And so when you're telling a story, it turns out it activates 7 regions of the brain. And so it's the sensory cortex, the cerebellum, Wernicke's area, which we just talked about. Visual cortex can get activated, olfactory perhaps, auditory for sure, with sounds, the Broca area, and then the motor cortex. And when you do that, the brain lights up. And in fact, when they've actually done PET scans of people listening to information versus listening to a story, something profound happens. It's like a Christmas tree. It is lit up. And if you want people to really engage, you need to light up all the areas, not just a couple. So here we go. And in my book, 7's always better than 2. I'll take it all the time. So rule number 4 is to tap into the brain's software to engage your audience. And in fact, we do have software. There's not 0s and 1s, but we do have what's called narrative schema. And it turns out that it acts kind of like software. And it turns out that our brain is looking for a story. Our brain is actually looking for information in the story. And when it doesn't get it, it tends to wander off into other places. And so if we somehow had a meter here and we could somehow watch where people's minds were going as the presentations were happening today, they could have gone to all kinds of places. You know, did I pick up the dry cleaning? Did I turn off the stove when I left the house? You know, what am I going to do for dinner tonight? You know, our mind will go all kinds of places. But when we're listening to a story, we tend to stay fairly focused. So here are the things the mind's looking for. It's looking for an introduction of a setting and characters. Our mind is looking for that. It's looking for an explanation. What's going on with these characters? What's happening here? What's occurring? It's also looking for an event. Does something happen to suddenly spur the beginning of a story? Does an invasive species somehow, ride on a flower and make its way into the United States, which suddenly precipitates a whole series of events? There's a response by the protagonist. The protagonist thinks of, geez, we got to figure out how to identify this species and then see what we can do about it. Do we fumigate them? Do we do something else with them? Do we invite them to leave the country? They just generally don't tend to respond to us that way. There's usually what's called complicating action. You all know complicating action. My favorite example of complicating action is from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Probably a movie that most of us have seen, at least, I don't know, maybe not some younger people, but if you haven't, you need to go see it. I forget how many, it's probably been 20 years since that came out. But if you remember, Harrison Ford is there, and he's in the cave, and he's about to pick up the jewel that he's been seeking, and as he lifts it off the pedestal, the room begins to shake. And he suddenly realizes he's initiated something that is very dangerous, and suddenly a gigantic ball of stone or a huge boulder is rolling out at him, and he's running for his life, and he barely makes it through the hole of the cave, the opening of the cave, just as the boulder crashes into it, and he thinks that his life is safe, but there are aboriginals there who are not happy that he's in their territory. He's being chased through the woods, and poison darts are being shot at him. And then he dives into a big lake where his boat is, the airplane is waiting for him or whatever, and it's filled with snakes. And he hates snakes. That's complicating action. So if you want to make people engaged with your topic, give us some kind of the complicating actions that evolve with these bugs, because there's a lot of complicating action that we've heard today. It's not just one thing happens, but suddenly you have a whole multiple series of things occurring, and that's complicating action. There's then an outcome and a response to the outcome, a reaction to the outcome by our protagonists. And I'll give you a couple examples in a moment of this. Rule 5 is to build your presentation like a story. So the question is, what is a story? So I thought I would give you two kind of contrasting examples. A lot of things that pass as a story don't quite make it as a story. So when I got up this morning, I was visiting a friend in Boulder that I haven't seen in years. And I went to the refrigerator, and I was going to have a bowl of cereal, and there was no milk. There was almond milk, but I wanted real milk. And so I got in the car, and I drove to the 7-Eleven down the block, and I bought a quart of milk and came back and ate my cereal. How many of you would pay $10 to see that movie? No hands. Okay. So let me tell you a different story. So I got up this morning at my friend's house, and I wanted to have some cereal, and I went in and saw there was no milk. And I got into the car, and I drove down to the 7-Eleven, and as I entered the door, I realized there was a holdup in progress. There was a man there holding a gun pointing at the cash register attendant, and I said, "Hey, what's going on here?" And the man swiveled around and pointed the gun at me, and I do not like people pointing guns at me, and I walked right up to him, and I grabbed his hand with the gun in it, and we began struggling with the gun. And pretty soon bullets were going off, and I saw that 4 bullets went into the milk case, and milk was pouring out, and now I was really upset. And I grabbed that gun, I was able to extract it from his hand, I hit him over the head, knocked him out, and at that moment, here comes the complicating action, the door opens, and his drive-away accomplice comes in pointing a gun. I take the gun, I shoot the guy in the leg, he drops to the ground. I grab both guns, put them on the counter, go get the last quart of milk left in the milk stand there that hasn't been damaged by bullets, put my $2.50 on the counter, and I go home and have my cereal. Now, that's a story. Okay? So what's distinct about that from the first one? Can anybody give me an idea what was distinct about that one versus the first? Anybody? Conflict, thank you. Yeah, there was a problem. There was conflict. No conflict, no story. And the interesting thing with all the challenges that you deal with, you have a lot of conflict, a lot of potential conflict. We've got man against bug, bug against plant, bug against bug. There's a lot that you have an opportunity to actually bring to life with your stories. So, as far as I can tell, stories have characters, they've got a setting, they've got a plot, they have conflict, and they always have resolution. And you can look for lots of definitions of story, and there's different permutations of that, but you got to have all these things in it to make it a good story. Now, it turns out that the narrative schema, which I was just talking to you about, is a pretty good model for a story. It's what I would call a plot structure. But it also happens to be a pretty good presentation structure. It's a great structure for actually structuring your presentation. And when I was working with Charles, I actually used that structure for the presentation that we did on the research that he'd been doing on BT and its microencapsulation. So we'll get back to that. I'm going to give you some examples of that in a minute, but I want to tell you a few other rules of my rules. So pictures trump words every time, and I'm not talking about Donald Trump and his words. I'm talking about trumping words. Pictures are powerful, and a lot of you had a number of pictures, and we'll talk about the effective use of pictures here for a moment. So, for example, if I was going to give you the history of DDT, you do not want to do this. And so I saw in a number of the presentations, we had a lot of copy on those boards. Don't do this to your audience. Because one, you're trying to read it now, right? That's what you're going, okay, what's it say? And you're reading, and you're not paying attention to me, you're paying attention to trying to read that. What you might want to do is actually to give the history of DDT, is talk about this, and actually I have a very personal experience with this, because as a kid growing up in Tampa, Florida, they used to come by and spray all the time. And who knew the effects of DDT? Because we thought it was the coolest thing to get on our bicycles and ride right behind those trucks. And probably, all the health challenges I've had in my life are attributable to those early experiences of riding behind those DDT spray trucks. But this turned out, it was a miracle pesticide, right? It had huge benefits. Little did we know about the impact it had on human beings and other organisms. Back in World War II, there's also an interesting story, is that many people, especially when we invaded Italy and we were taking Italy back, it turned out that lice was a huge problem, and lice carry typhus. There was a typhus outbreak, and they used DDT. They actually dusted people with DDT to kill the lice, and they were able actually to avert a huge health disaster in Italy because of DDT. So it had great benefits in some ways. But then we know, this research began to evolve to show that actually DDT was having a huge impact, especially on our avian friends, and especially our bald eagle. And suddenly people were awakening to the fact that DDT might not be a great pesticide to use, and it might have such deleterious effects that we would want to outlaw it. And then came out this wonderful book, Silent Spring, which actually spurred the whole environmental movement. So you can use pictures to tell the story without a word on the screen. So use the pictures as a device for storytelling. Rule number 7. If you're seeking an emotional response, and remember, most decisions are grounded in emotion. We'd like to think as scientists that people are rational and that people make decisions rationally. But if you look at what's happening, especially a lot of the work around economists now, or behavioral economics, we know now that people are not very rational when they make decisions. They're actually fairly emotional. And that there's a term, what I call the universals always contained in the particular. I've done a lot of work over the years with nonprofits and around fundraising. And there's a guy named Paul Slovic who did a lot of research to find out, why do people give money? And I think the model is generalizable to you. So first of all, there's an image. So let's say I was doing an ad and I wanted to get people to give money to save children who are dying of hunger. So usually the ad, I'd have a picture of a starving child. That picture would get my attention. It would produce a feeling. I'd go, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And out of that would be the impulse to either give or to get engaged, okay? And it turns out that feelings, not analytical thinking, actually drive engagement with a mission. They also drive fundraising. I could give you all the data in the world. I could say 4 million people are starving in Africa today, and you wouldn't open your paycheck, your wallet, to give money. But if I showed you a picture of one child who was starving, you were suddenly emotionally engaged, and you will be more likely to get involved. And I think the same is true for your work. So let's try a little experiment. Take a look here and focus on one of the children. These are all impoverished children. Which one gets your attention? So just see what happens as you're looking at these pictures for a second. We'll give you a second. Choose one. You all got one? Okay. So let's slowly get rid of them until we end up with one. Now look at the impact of that one picture versus the 5 or 6 pictures. It's much more impactful, right? And it turns out that if I've given you numbers, numbers tend to interfere with feelings of compassion toward people who are suffering. And I think numbers also tend to interfere with people's engagement with a mission or a new idea. And so sometimes what we often do is we mix a lot of numbers with pictures, and it's more powerful to use one picture at a time than having 5 or 6 pictures on the screen. And if you go back and look at some of your presentations that you've given, there were many that were really good today, but often you had a lot of pictures, okay? And what that does is it divides attention. It divides people's attention. Rule 8, use video to demonstrate complicated ideas, but don't use it to encapsulate your whole presentation. So when I was working with Charles on this presentation, one of the things that's really important about BT is that it's really good for killing the larvae of butterflies and moths that are actually killing crops. But you and I, as human beings, are not impacted by that. But if you tell the common person that, they go, "Really? You sure about that?" And you say, "Well." So I went online. I found that one of your colleagues somewhere, created a wonderful little animated piece that we used in the presentation. So either create the animation, and I'll play it for you right now. Let's hope that the volume works.
BT is actually a group of closely related soil microbes. Each type of BT makes a different kind of protein that is toxic to specific groups of insects. When these insects eat the protein, it changes shape and attaches to the insect gut wall, creating holes in it. Soon after, these insect larvae stop feeding and they eventually die. In contrast, when people eat the same proteins, they don't change shape and they don't cause us harm.
So this came from OSU. Wonderful little piece to illustrate this, but if you want to really illustrate, you need to tell another story. So it turns out that Vladimir Smirnov, scientist in Canada, was one of the first people who started doing a lot of work with BT back in the 50s. Is that right, Charles? Yeah. And so he was at a conference like this, and he was trying to convince his colleagues that BT was not toxic to human beings, and he had a glass of it on the desk, and he drank the glass of it to demonstrate that. And later in his memoirs, he divulged that he was a little concerned for a few days. He just wasn't sure that, he knew theoretically that it wasn't going to hurt him, but that was a risky thing to do. But it certainly did demonstrate the fact that it wasn't toxic. So use video, use it sparingly, but use it especially if you have a concept that may be a difficult concept to illustrate. Rule 9, build your presentation as a series of stories. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of the presentation I did with Charles. And so we just told stories throughout the whole piece. And so, but I want to show you that I used the structure of the narrative schema to actually structure this presentation. So I'm just going to give you a real quick piece of this. So let's get through it here. So the first is let's see here. The first is to give people background. What's the setting here? And so we started with the beginning of agriculture. Human beings agricultural societies have been around for a few thousand years, and it's changed the way sapiens lived on this planet. Started with the Egyptians, but it was mostly a human affair with the help of animals. Even in the earliest 19th century, we were still actually working with horses and out there in the fields ourselves. But then there was the advent of the tractor, which changed agriculture profoundly. And now we see with agriculture today, it's a pretty industrialized affair and fairly sophisticated. So here's the problem, though, is that with bugs, we know that 90% of it, like an apple crop, can be affected by various kinds of larvae that are laid on apples. Either they're not edible or they're not sellable because they've been damaged. We also know that there are 1.6 billion insects to one person. It's a losing battle, and we all know that. I mean, we're outnumbered, far outnumbered by them. Another way to illustrate that is an acre field may have more bugs than all the human beings on our whole planet. 1 acre field of land. So once again, you can take and use things to illustrate and tell a story to help people understand the profound impact that bugs have. So what's the state of affairs? Well, we know that lepidopterans are beautiful creatures. I think there's some tour of the butterfly enclosure here in Denver, and this one is maybe one of the few bugs that we love to let that light on our hands and sit on our head, and we think it's so wonderful. But we know that they can have a huge impact on our world because they lay their eggs on all kinds of things, and they're very cute. But we know that they can have an impact on crops, and in terms of cabbages, they can completely decimate a cabbage, and you'll find them everywhere. Our fruits and tomatoes. If you grew tomatoes this summer, you probably were struggling with them, and things like corn. So we know that these wonderful, beautiful butterflies and moths can have a huge impact. Now, they also can have an impact on our forests, and that's one of the things that Smirnov was working with. Is that the forests up in Canada were being decimated by a particular, is it the boll weevil? What is it, Charles? Spruce bugworm. So, and you can begin to see, if you can look at the pictures, a whole forest can actually be destroyed by one worm, and they were spraying BT throughout that area. So there's an emotional response by our protagonists, okay? And starting back around 2500 BC, the Sumerians started using sulfur to help deal with bugs. And then the Chinese began working with oils and other kinds of herbs. And around 1100 AD, they developed soap. We're still using soap on vegetables to help prevent bugs. But there's complicating action, and we just told the story of DDT, and I won't tell it again. But here we have a complicated. We came up with a great solution, but it also had consequences that were adverse. And now there was another emotional response, and that was the discovery of BT by a Japanese scientist in the early 1900s. He discovered that silkworms were actually dying because they had ingested BT. He was the first to discover it, and then another scientist in Germany from an area of Germany for which it's named after came on and developed more understanding of how it was affecting flower moths that were eating flower. So more complicating action. Here's the real big complicating action is the challenge, is that BT, when sprayed on crops, is affected by the sun. I created that little animation that was a little fun to do. Didn't take much to do, but it certainly did illustrate the idea about sun coming over a field and affecting the crop. And so it doesn't last. So if you go and spray, you got to come back and spray in 2 or 3 days. So it's a continual process, expensive, and it also impacts the land. So here's another response. It was with Charles's team. Is they just said, what if we microencapsulated BT? And I'm not going to get into all the details, but here's one of their areas where they were testing a microencapsulated version that was actually made possible by nanotechnology, and they had an incredible outcome. And in fact, the larval mortality went up considerably over the use of spray BT in its regular form. In fact, it had a 3-time residual activity. So that's an outcome. And then the real outcome is beautiful plants, our wildlife is not impacted, and our children are also not impacted by it. So, and then we have the reaction to the outcome, and now Charles and his team are looking to get governmental approval. They're looking for industrial partners to actually develop it and see whether it's economically viable. And so there's the story, and that's in a very quick version, but that's what we presented. So you can take a fairly complicated, if you looked at Charles's paper, it's a scientific paper, and we actually turned it into a series of stories to actually tell the story of agriculture, pesticides, and a new approach that actually has very promising opportunities. So Rule 10 is to create a log line for your presentation that speaks to your audience. And I would say this is, in some ways, like the title. So I thought I'd give you... Anybody know what a log line is? Any movie people here? Well, you probably do know what a log line is. You don't realize it. So what is it? So The Godfather. Here's a movie that probably most of you have seen. And here's the log line for The Godfather. The aging patriarch of an organized crime dynasty transfers control of his clandestine empire to his reluctant son. That pretty much tells you what the movie's about, right? Okay. Here's another one of my favorites, Forrest Gump. Probably most of us saw Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump, while not intelligent, has accidentally been present in many historic events, but his true love, Jenny Curran, eludes him. And that sort of sums up the movie. And here's one of my favorite films, is The Shawshank Redemption. If you haven't seen it, go see it, rent it. But 2 imprisoned men bond over a number of years, finding solace and eventual redemption through acts of common decency. And so what would be the log line? I'll share with you Charles's log line, which was really the title of his paper. This is the before, and it's the controlled release of Bacillus thuringiensis formulations encapsulated in light-resistant colloidal-somal microcapsules improves our ability to manage lepidopteran pests of brassica crops. A great title for a scientific paper, but if you're talking to a non-scientific audience, they're already heading for the doors, you know? So here's what we came up with. The story is how a little-known bacterium can make agriculture safer and more productive. Simple. And notice the picture that we use. So why do you think this is the picture? Anybody want to venture a guess? Safety, but it also tells something else. There's something else in the story. So someone's barefoot, so that suggests safety. What else does it tell us? Simple. But it turns out that BT lives in the first few inches of the soil. It's everywhere. We can walk around barefoot and not be impacted by it. So we've simplified this idea. Rule 11, there are hundreds of ways to leave a lover, as Paul Simon says, and maybe there's at least 100 ways to tell a story. I think you ought to aim for 6 and choose one. So if I'm ever working on a story, and I work on lots of stories for a lot of different applications, before I sit down and really start working on that story, I think, what are the different ways I might want to tell this story? And first of all, I start with the audience, what's the purpose, and then I begin to ask the question, how could I tell this story? And there's probably this story that I just told you very briefly of the paper we developed for this presentation. We could have told it in a number of other ways. Time factor, it turns out, was one of the questions. People said, well, we don't have a half an hour often. I said, well, that's great. If I only had 5 minutes, I would have to cut out a lot of that. I'd have to cut out a lot. So, you have to look at how you want to approach it. So I start very rough early on, and then I begin to hone in. How do I want to tell the story? Rule 12, don't be afraid to entertain your audience. They'll appreciate it They'll appreciate you. So you don't want to have this. How many of you know what the MIGO effect is? It's a scientific term. It's my eyes glaze over. And you've probably been here in audiences where you can just see people getting glassy eyed, certainly by 4:30 in the afternoon after many presentations. So don't be afraid to make them laugh. Give them something that's entertaining as well as informative. And that's hard for us, for you maybe as scientists. It's a hard thing to do, but be willing to kind of have some fun with your presentation and get people engaged. They'll remember you for it and they'll appreciate you. And lastly, rule number 13, your PowerPoint is not a handout. And what I often see people do is they've got a ton of copy on the slides, and then they print that out, and that's the handout for the presentation. Don't do that. It's deathly. Design your PowerPoint to engage and entertain people, and if they want a handout, create a handout that has key points in it, has bullets and all that other stuff, and let them read that if they're really interested. But don't do it on your PowerPoint slide. And that's the end of the story. So, you can live to tell another story another day and have a big impact on your world.